So what are my top 10 fantasy books? By that I mean prose, novels, and fantasy, not science fiction or science fantasy, where there's a crossover between the two. I'm excluding those which are future set, assuming some kind of scientific background, inverted commas, that sort of thing. So that's the qualification for this. I've not done this video before. I did do my top 10 books of all genres in 2021. I did a top 10 fantasy series / worlds video, which will mirror some of what I'm going to say now. But yeah, I think this is useful and interesting to do, partly because it's fun to talk about books I like, but also because it helps you know my palate, know if we have palate alignment, as the wine phrase goes. And so yeah, I'm going to go 10 to 2, but I'm actually going to start with one because it's really obvious. No surprises, it's Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is the masterpiece, the undeniable literary masterpiece of the fantasy genre. It culminates, or it is the culmination of a period of development in the genre, both within Tolkien, if you just want to think about his work from 1916 or 15 or whatever to 1948, but also it is the culmination of the early era of both sci-fi and fantasy, but building from from your folk tales through your early pioneers, your Dunsaneys and MacDonalds, into the time where genre fiction became a sort of increasingly reputable or pseudo-reputable, semi-reputable thing to be doing. And the fact it combines the world building with the plot, with the beautiful writing, and the genuinely masterful structure is, it's something which I don't think many fantasy novels could even claim to come close to, or science fiction novels. There's a couple of sci-fi novels I can think of, but really this is pretty much in a class on its own. It's not quite Shakespeare in that it hasn't ruined fantasy since. It has actually become a springboard for fantasy since, but it's because it so informs the tropes, the language, the style. Even when tropes are being subverted, more often than not there is an Oxonian ghost over the shoulder with a hobbit-like complexion. So yeah, Lord of the Rings number 1, no surprises there. Number 10 then, cheating, going back, is The Dark Tower. This is maybe the most controversial thing on this list, and I say that because even people who love The Dark Tower will not pick this as their favourite book. There are structural issues with this. It is rambling. It's Kingian in that it's sort of all over the place constantly. There's a herring about between things. There's a constant desire to throw in new elements, and this book might be the worst of the Dark Tower novels for that. But I also love it for that. I actually think, rarely, I understand amongst Dark Tower fans, but I think it is a triumphant conclusion. And so when I say my top 10 favourite fantasy novels, I guess there is, in that sense, there's a subjective element, isn't there, that I'm saying these are the books I like the most. And in that particular definition, The Dark Tower is the Dark Tower book I like the most. Maybe drawing of the three, or particularly The Wastelands, comes close. The Wastelands might be joint, but I think the two are, they're there, but The Dark Tower has the crescendos, the conclusions, the finale that I wanted, and I think the coda is really interesting as well. So I'm not one of those people who hate the epilogue. Number 9, we are at. This is a really interesting book. This is Neverwhere. Neverwhere is Neil Gaiman, of course, and it's what can you say about Neverwhere? It is a book about a guy who goes through a door and ends up being forgotten by the above ground world and living in the sewers of London amongst a fantasy civilization, which is wonderful world building. It's, again, is it necessarily Gaiman's best novel? I think so, but it's a kind of interesting way in which it relates to the TV series it connects to. Like The Princess Bride, there's an interconnectedness between the writing of a book and the writing of a series, or a film in that case. And American Gods may be better. I think there's a funny thing with Gaiman, that when I think, okay, I love Neil Gaiman as a writer, a large part of what I mean is, and I like a lot of his writing, is I love The Sandman. but this is, I'm defining it as fantasy novels today, and they are graphic novels, but they are not novels. And I think Neverwhere captured me in a way that though American Gods may be the bigger achievement and the kind of, it's certainly the bigger book, I think, and there's more stuff in the world which makes it a more interesting world. Neverwhere, which I think is set to get a sequel soon, 30 years later. Neverwhere is just a wonderful realisation of a particular set of quite British and London tropes, but also of Gaiman's fairy tale quirk, his humour, his aesthetics, and I think it's just a really fun book. So I certainly recommend that if you're interested in an adult novel by Gaiman. I notice actually a lot of people read some of his more mixed age, kind of where it could be a middle grade book or it could be an adult book because there's layers to it. I understand that, but I think Neverwhere is my favourite of his novels, and it is my number 9. I think we said, didn't we? Yes, we're on number 9. Number 8. What should I pick out of the pile? Let's go for this one. I think this will be my number 8. These, is there a strict ordering to these? Not really. Lord of the Rings at the top, yes. Probably Dark Tower at the bottom. But I like all of these, and 2 to 9 are probably pretty close in terms of how much I esteem them. But Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is literary fantasy, I guess. It is a stonker, 900 and nearly 1,000 pages in my edition. No, over 1,000 pages in my edition. This is a wonderful book. It's part pastiche, part straight serious fantasy. But it is set in the early 19th century, about the last magicians, more or less, in England. Magic is a dying, indisreputable art, and Mr. Norrell is really the expert. But another guy, Jonathan Strange, comes up and what is now a magician. But there are all sorts of interesting things about them and about London society and about magical history. But there are also entanglements with fairy and the great dangers of how you gain power. And Strange and Norrell themselves are both brilliant characters. There are some short stories in this universe which I own but have not read, which I'd like to. I like books you can sink into. I think this is, Lord of the Rings is not actually that kind of thing. It is in one way, so is the Silmarillion, but it's not. It's something which is much more demanding, and say Book of the New Sun, similarly on the sci-fi side. This is, though there is real intellect there, it is something you can sink into, wonderfully descriptive, funny sections where you can just sort of enjoy yourself as you go, as well as the weird, scary, sometimes scary sections. So that is my number. Are we on 8 now? Are we saying? Yeah, number 8. Strange and Norrell. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Yeah. So this will be our 7, I think. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. Possibly controversial because, of course, this would go under normally a different genre. This is magical realism. Complicated. I mostly agree with Sir Terry Pratchett's quip. I forget the exact line, but more or less that magical realism is a way of you're calling a fantasy book something that people will respect. There's some truth to that because you can see it's something which, in terms of literary fiction, was for a long time a legitimate and accepted form of writing, where if the author had just said, I've written a fantasy book about some things and it's got some themes in it, you could imagine there being less interest. I also bluntly wonder if there's a degree of the exotic. This was by a bunch of Latin American authors writing chiefly in Spanish, one significant English author. But yeah, I think this is probably, it's not my favourite Marquez novel. I think that's Love in the Time of Cholera, which is, this is the complication. The flip side is magical realism is something which describes a book, Love in the Time of Cholera, which is not fantasy. It has the same tone and feel as both Marquez's other magical realist books, but also other magical realist books by and stories. Your Borges, your Puig, your Allende. So I wouldn't want to sort of say is my favourite Marquez novel, but it is my favourite Marquez novel, which is fantastical explicitly. And it's about the 7 generations of the Buendia family and of Macondo, the town they've built. this is this Colombian village that goes through. It is the opposite of Encanto. If you've seen that film, it goes through all kinds of trials and tribulations with increasing pain, corruption, alienation within the family and between people. It's an analogy or an allegory. That's a word we use in a very loose way. But it's an analogy or an allegory or a fable about Colombia, about the Colombian civil wars, and about their long impact. It's about human existence. It's about the way we relate to each other and what we need to survive and thrive. And it is not tough to read. It is very enjoyable. It's something where there is a lot of humour and vibrancy to a story, which is nonetheless, and magical realism often has humour and vibrancy in the midst of very serious circumstances. So yeah, that is my number 7, I think we're saying. I think, probably, here is my 6. Not the whole complete Chronicles of Conan, though, hey, it's one book, I could say so. The one novel Howard wrote is what I'm going to include, and this could maybe even stand for other classic fantasy novels, which maybe aren't top 10, but which I really like. But Hour of the Dragon, which is Conan losing his throne and working to regain it toward the end of his career. It's a thoroughly entertaining book. It is so much of what Howard had practiced and iterated over the course of his career, just all in one place, and fine-tuned to a high pitch. I think it's his biggest achievement, and I think in the fantasy genre, and this is pre-Tolkien too, so it's relevant to think in those terms. In the fantasy genre, and particularly in action fantasy, heroic fantasy, there's very little that matches it, certainly on the kind of action fantasy side of things, pace-wise as well. If you like pacey books, if you like the pulp pacing system, this is the best articulation of it ever. So that is my number 6, I think. My 5, these are all close. I think it's going to have to be this way around. Talking about heroic fantasy, probably my favourite heroic fantasy novel of all is Legend by David Gemmell. It's the first Draenei novel, and many of the others are worth reading, as are others of his novels. This is my favourite of his, though, his first novel of all, because though it is not as stylistically clean and fine as many of his other books, there is a freshness and an emotional core to it which has never left me, and which constantly teaches me on my many rereads. It's not a particularly long novel either. My edition is just over 400 pages in a very kind of, you can sort of see the it's not particularly big text or anything. The characters are great. Druss the legend, the old man who is afraid of dying in his bed, ends up going to join the doomed defence of Dros Delnoch against the Nadir hordes. And heroic fantasy has never been finer. It has not been equalled, I think, by its famous. Well, if you look at your David Gemmell award winners, you'll not find, I think, anything that meets that combination of character stakes and action and pathos, soft philosophy. That it's just very, very good, and I think people are coming to appreciate it. As I talk to people on BookTube or in Discord, on Discords and stuff, you can see there is a growing understanding that Gemmell was a very important author and a very fine author, but nonetheless he's underappreciated, and I strongly recommend him. I should say he was a very good seller, which of course can be, maybe more at this point than Once Upon a Time, can be a black mark, but there we are. My number 4, I've got 2 books because one, they're kind of joint, but 2, I kind of want to cheat and throw a spanner into the works of the system. So Lion Witch Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis. There we go. And because that is the obvious one, I've talked about it before, it's a really well-paced, tight, inventive, jolly, touching story. It is the first Narnia book, and it may be, it's hard to say, but in many ways it's probably Lewis's best novel. There are other Narnian books that come up there. I'll mention one in a second. That Hideous Strength has a breadth and a depth which none of the Narnia novels match on their own. But that hideous strength has structural issues. Till We Have Faces similarly has enormous depth, but again, some kind of structural pacing issues, which the Narnia books just don't struggle with. They are able to wear their seriousness light on top of the kind of middle grade children's fiction structure. I've also chosen, I think, to sort of sum up what I like about it, The Silver Chair, which is my other favourite Narnia novel. Great covers, these ones. In which, so Lion Witch Wardrobe, 4 children go through a wardrobe and they go into a land ruled by a wicked queen where everything is icy. But there seems to be rumours something might be about to change for the better. Silver Chair, 2 children who kind of know the other children, but are not the same as those 4 children, end up in Narnia, and they end up going underneath Narnia into a world of increasing madness. Even from the point they enter Narnia and they're above ground, things get increasingly strange, and there is a aesthetic to Silver Chair which is very, very strong. It's one of the books, if you want to look at your Planet Narnia stuff and the way in which Lewis interweaved medieval cosmology into the Narniad, Silver Chair is not a bad place to start. It along with Lion Witch Wardrobe and maybe Prince Caspian, is the most obvious one. But Silver Chair particularly is obvious once you know the visual cues you're looking for, because the aesthetic is so thoroughly integrated into it being moon themed. It is the moon in terms of the planets that he's using as guides for each book. And yeah, the growing madness, the density of the air as they fall from Aslan's land down to Narnia, as they go beneath the moon into the sublunar realms. It's one, it's really fun, it's really interesting, it's really aesthetically strong, but 2, it's also really interesting when you're thinking about the broader themes of Narnia, which are much broader perhaps than people realise. My number 3 book, this almost feels like this could be number 2, or even not number 1. Basically number 1 and 2 probably are locked, but this is the book which troubles them. This is Lavondis by Robert Holdstock, the second book in the Mythico Wood cycle. This one is, it's got a recommendation by Kim Stanley Robinson. This one is introduced by Lisa Tuttle. Mythico Wood, the first one, is in this series introduced by Neil Gaiman. It is that kind of book. Holdstock, and I think Philip Pullman likes them as well. Holdstock is a challenging writer. I don't mean that as a criticism. He is like Gene Wolfe in that, who would come very high on my sci-fi rankings, but he is an immensely challenging writer in terms of, particularly in less so Mythico Wood, that is a challenging book, but in this and the third book, The Hollowing, which I've read, those are both, he demands a lot of the reader emotionally and intellectually on a fairly madcap journey through. How do you describe the concept? The concept basically is that the human imagination leaves imprints on nature, on woods particularly, on old woods, on old oak woods most of all. And so a relatively small wood, just a few miles squared, Ryep Wood in England, contains vast forests of mythology. But this is not a kind of like, man, that sounds cool. You can imagine if C.S. Lewis came up with the same idea, and this is praise to C.S. Lewis, you can imagine it being like, oh, there's a wardrobe and inside there is a kingdom. And that sort of thing. You can see there being a different tone, but for Holdstock, it is psychologically intense, cerebral, incredibly at points emotional, aesthetically visionary. There's a massively cinematic quality about some of it. He has a massively cinematic eye, and also just kind of incredibly, like your mind is often like, oh wait, so this is happening. Oh, does this connect to this? Oh, he was this the whole time, and it's hard to describe. It also has a wonderful style. It's beautifully written. It's hard to describe what it is unless you read it, and I actually do think that can be a type of praise. Lord of the Rings, here's the thing, if I said Lord of the Rings was a hobbit goes to destroy a ring, it's a magical ring from a bad person, and he goes to destroy it in a magical place. That is true. That is what the story of Lord of the Rings is, but it is not what Lord of the Rings is. Even to describe some of the instances, and of course, he goes on adventures, and there's knights, and there's battles, is not to describe what Lord of the Rings is. And Mythigo would, as in general, Lavondis in particular, is that on steroids. I think it's one of the most intense examples of being bemused and in wonder and enraptured. It is like if Neil Gaiman's operatic older brother. I guess that's maybe a way to think about it. One sign of what's going on in Lavondis, both thematically and also aesthetically, some of the styles that he goes into, is this is a pretty intense fantasy book with enormous invention, crazy stuff going on. But for the first quarter or first third, a major character is the real-life composer, Ralph Vaughan Williams, who is just in the village picking up on folk tunes and talking to a young girl about the magical masks that she thinks she owns or has made. It's how could it? Talus gets lost in a wood, but the wood contains every human legend imaginable. That is pretty much it. Number 2, then, this is then kind of the mock number 1, the surprise top. I think this will be less surprising to people who know what I like, but I think Lavondis could challenge for this. I think that this book still, over rereads, has held the crown. This is a book I do reread regularly. Night Watch by Terry Pratchett, with this wonderful, is it Rubens cover? It's not Rubens, it's Paul Kidby. I'm trying to think, is it based on Rubens, or is it based on someone else? But that, Dutch master, Dutch realist of the 17th century, the Night Watch, but replaced with all these Discworld characters. The gimmick is that Sam Vimes, our hero of the Guard novels, he ends up being transported back in time, and it turns out that his old mentor, when he was a young watchman, who kept him on the straight and narrow and inspired him to be pretty much the one good cop in Ankh-Morpork, which leads him into much greater trouble later on. Vimes is transported back, and he finds that his mentor has been killed or is dead. And so he becomes his mentor basically to preserve the timeline. The monk of time you can see in Buddhist robes there tells him he has to, so he goes and does that. And the complication is that this is against the background of a pretty brutal dictatorship, even more brutal than Ankh-Morpork's current, very efficient but brutal dictatorship, brutally efficient. It's a brutal but incompetent and bizarre dictatorship, and there is revolution brewing. And the Watch are going to get caught up in it, whether they like it or not. And Vimes is at his best here. But so this is the thing. Pratchett was a serious writer most of the time, all the time, really. But at his best, it wasn't a sort of, he's got some clever ideas and he's got some jokes that represent some of his ideas and he's explained that well. But he achieved real sublimity. Emotional sublimity, and I think this is, for me, the best example of that. That this is a novel that you can read as you can't get away from the fact it's a comedy book, but you could read it as a straight drama in terms of the character stakes, in terms of the things being discussed and the things he's trying to work out, the complexities of life, the way in which, for a man who can be pretty glib and amusingly glib about things, at the point at which there is a maturation process as a writer, I think, where suddenly the glibness is no longer glib, and he is able to deal with a lot of very big themes to do with nature and nurture, duty, responsibility, risk. Some of it about, I guess, history, the way history is formed, what people think they are doing when they have revolutions, for instance. All those things, and when they are in power, and the risks of power, which is a major theme of Discworld. Almost the biggest intentional gag is that one of our heroes is a brutal dictator who believes in one man, one vote. He is the man, he has the vote. But there's an observation there by a man, Pratchett, who certainly did not believe in dictatorship, but an observation there about the kind of almost the humour of our political aspirations, that it turns out that Ankh-Morpork ends up quite happy underneath its quietly and unostentatiously efficient dictator rather than needing anything else. So yeah, Night Watch is my number 2 then, and so my mock number 1 for the sake of this video. I wouldn't start there if you're reading Discworld. I think with the others, you can start with Lavondis. I'd probably start with Mythico Wood, you'll benefit from it, but you can start with Lavondis. Certainly you can start with Lion Witch Wardrobe, you can start with Legend, you can start with Hour of the Dragon. All of these then, yeah, all of these are standalones apart from, the first book, apart from the Dark Tower and this. This one, I would certainly go back to Guards, at least. Read Guards, Men at Arms, Feet of Clay, I guess is it Jingo, I think Fifth Elephant, and then Night Watch. I can be corrected on the order. And then there are a couple more City Watch novels after that. But it's the best Discworld novel. It is the best Pratchett novel. And for me, it is, without needing qualification for it being a comedy or anything else, it is one of my favourite fantasy novels. What are your favourite fantasy novels? Why do you like them? What subgenres are overrepresented compared to the norm? Like I'm struck that I have a lot of relatively, I say a lot of, I've got several heroic or actiony fantasies. Legend, Lord of the Rings is epic, I guess. Dark Tower and Conan are all in that kind of bag. But then I go over to a couple of literary fantasies as well. So what is your strong sections? You know, are you really into kind of magical, like wizard school kind of stuff? Well, you know the idea. Are you really into gritty, pseudo grimdark? Tell me what your favourite books are in the fantasy genre and why in the comments. Till next time.